How is everybody tonight? We're going to talk about some gruesome deaths and murders. That's pretty much what I do every night, you know. My name is Adam Selzer. As she said, I'm the chief historian for the Mysterious Chicago podcast and blog. No research topic ever has kept me more occupied than H.H. Holmes. It is a huge rabbit hole to fall down, and reading Devil in the White City is really just scratching the surface of the whole mystery of this guy and what he was really up to and what he didn't do. A lot of the information about him is buried. It is buried in things like the microfilm archives at the Harold Washington Library. There were a lot of different newspapers in Chicago that sent reporters out to the castle site, interviewed all of the neighbors, interviewed all of the witnesses, everybody who had ever met Holmes. Then if you dig into Boston papers, the Boston papers sent people out to his hometown to interview his family. The Philadelphia and New York papers talked to him in prison. But depending on which aspect of the story you're researching, you have to know which paper to be looking in. A lot of the books and movies about Holmes have been based on just like what one guy I know of did all of his stuff just on the New York Times. The New York Times didn't have a reporter on the ground. They were just piecing it together from Chicago papers. And beyond just what's in the newspapers, and you can spend days and days on the newspapers, one of the really fun things is going to the legal archives and getting these piles of dusty, moldy old papers. At the legal archives downtown, there's a microfilm thing listing all of the lawsuits. H.H. Holmes got sued a lot. Just a lot. The man was a swindler first and foremost. So not only under his own name, some of these aren't even under his own name. Like this one up over here is the Chicago Sash and Screen Door Company versus H.S. Campbell and Yates. H.S. Campbell was one of the many aliases that Holmes used. That was a lawsuit that details all of the insurance policies he had on the building we called the Murder Castle. He had a lot of insurance on that place, and he set fire to it a couple of times. For the insurance money, of course. H.H. Holmes, from as near as we can tell, came to Chicago about 1886. He lived here until late 1893, at which point he started traveling around. He was arrested just as a swindler in 1894. Then eventually they turned out there was a lot more in the case, and he was hanged in 1896. Figuring out the details of what he was up to during all of that period is very, very tricky. He's a notoriously hard guy to research. Like, for instance, there's one article I like to talk about sometimes is in a few years after he was executed, the Denver Post ran an article about a guy named W.J. Bunyea who had just given a speech about H.H. Holmes. He said that he was Holmes's old roommate from Englewood, Illinois. According to him, he told a long story of Holmes's career and then said that after he was arrested, he wrote him a letter saying, "Holmes, why did you do it?" And he said, "Holmes wrote me back and said, when I was a young man, somebody swindled my parents. And I decided to get revenge on the world by cheating everybody I met for the rest of my life." And that's an interesting way of looking at, we never really figured out exactly what made Holmes tick exactly. So that would be one angle of it. There's a few things that we have to figure out. First, we have to figure out if the Denver Post was telling the truth about all this. They could have just needed to fill space, and they might have just decided to rerun the story about H.H. Holmes and frame it around some guy they made up who was supposedly holding court in a tavern. Then if we establish that W.J. Bunyea was a real guy, that they were telling the truth, we have to establish that W.J. Bunyea was telling the truth, and that he really was H.H. Holmes' roommate, that he really did get all of this information from Holmes. And then even if we establish that, we have to figure out if H.H. Holmes was telling the truth about him having been swindled as a young man in the first place. Usually these things fall apart on the third one. No matter what we get right out of Holmes' mouth, that we have a saying in Holmes research circles, you could always tell if Holmes was lying because his lips were moving. The man was a notorious liar. He lied even when he didn't have to. He lied even when it only made things a whole lot harder for him, when it would have made things a whole lot easier to tell the truth. He seems to have started lying, like even his census records have lies on them. If you look at his census records, in 1870, he is 9 years old. In 1880, he's 23. If you do a little quick math, most people can only age 10 years in that amount of time, but, he was a remarkable human being. In this case, the W.J. Bunyea story, it falls apart on the second one. W.J. Bunyea was a real guy, and he does appear to have actually lived in Englewood for a while. But the names and dates that he gives in his story are completely off. And also, he's not the most reliable of sources. About a year after he gave the speech, he was arrested for shooting his barber. I don't know if he got a really bad haircut or what, But his story kind of falls apart. But in his story is possibly the first account of H.H. Holmes killing the pharmacist who lived across the street. This is a story that's come up in just about every Holmes book that's ever been written. The story, as it's told in Devil in the White City and most of the other Holmes books, going back to at least about the 1930s, is that when Holmes first came to Chicago, he happened into Dr. Holton's pharmacy on 63rd Street, Dr. E.S. Holton. Dr. Holton, it's always said, was an elderly man who was slowly dying of cancer upstairs while his poor hapless wife was trying to run the pharmacy by herself. So when this energetic young go-getter fresh out of medical school came in and said, hey, you should hire me to run this place for you, they were only too happy to do it. He took over the operations, then became the owner, at which point Dr. and Mrs. Holton completely disappeared and were never seen again. And it's always very broadly implied that Holmes obviously killed them. A while ago, I decided, I kind of took it up by myself. I'm going to figure out, I'm going to get to the bottom of this Holton's angle, because I'd read through article after article from the 1890s. Once in a while, it would mention that he had come into possession of Mrs. Dr. Holton's pharmacy. But there wasn't a lot of data on it. There wasn't any. I couldn't find a lawsuit between the Holtons or anything. I couldn't find anything about insurance companies looking for them or their families looking for them or wondering what became of them. The earliest was W.J. Bunyer saying that they had disappeared. So I started looking around. It's hard to research when all you have is the initials. All that we knew from a city directory, it was Dr. E.S. Holton's pharmacy. And, you know, there were a number of E.S. Holtons around. So finally I dug around and found eventually that I found a national medical directory. It was on Google Books, so it's all digital, but I think the whole thing would be bigger than I could carry. But I would have had to travel all over to find a place that had a copy of it. But it listed all of the pharmacists in Englewood. And one of them was E.S. Holton. It actually, the initials E.S. stood for Elizabeth Sarah. So the doctor was a woman. What? Turns out Dr. E.S. Holton was not an old man. It was actually a young woman. She was only a couple of years older than Holmes was. Her husband had some kind of job in the railway, nothing to do with the pharmacy. And she was operating the pharmacy on 63rd Street. She sold it to him right around the time she became pregnant with her second child. And there's a number of references saying that she had trouble getting the money from H.H. Holmes. But apparently she eventually did. There's no lawsuit on file. And she certainly didn't disappear. In fact, I took a selfie at her grave a while ago. So she and her husband both are buried not too terribly far away from where the murder castle was, right down at Oakwood Cemetery on the south side. That's Elizabeth Holton in the center there. She died in 1933, so she outlived Holmes considerably. William, her husband, died about 1910. He's on the right. One of their daughters is over to the left of them. And this is what we find with a lot of the stuff about H.H. Holmes. There's like a kernel of truth behind it, and then the legend is just sort of grown up around it. This happens over and over with angle after angle of the story. Quite a lot of them came from this. This is a page from the New York World. A lot of H.H. Holmes stuff that we think of now comes from the New York World. The New York World is a fascinating newspaper to read now. It was a kind of a combination of the New York Times and the National Enquirer. They did a lot of really in-depth reporting, but they also had no compunction whatsoever about just making stuff up. In fact, they're kind of notorious in newspaper history now. They made up this big story one time about a wild man living off in the forest. And they sent a woman named Annie Londonderry off to try to capture the wild man. She was working for them under the name The New Woman. She was famous herself because she had become the first woman to ride a bicycle all around the world. When she came back, she got a job with the New York World and was sent off to find the wild man. It was a huge sensation for a while, but it turned out they had just made the entire thing up. But she also interviewed H.H. Holmes a couple of times while he was in prison. But this one, what happened with Holmes is he started building his building, what we now call the Murder Castle, really early on, way earlier than people tend to think. It was actually started well before they even announced that there was going to be a World's Fair in Chicago. It happened shortly before the Paris World's Fair opened. The spring of 1887, they started drawing up the plans for it. That summer, they built the first floor and never paid the iron company. That's how we know most of this stuff, because the iron company eventually sued. After that, the next year, they put up a second floor, which was mostly long-term apartments. The third floor, the hotel area, is what we usually talk about now, but as near as I can tell, it barely existed. In fall of 1892, he went up to a guy who lived on the second floor, Dr. Maurice Lawrence, and said, "Dr. Lawrence, you know what I'm going to do now? I am going to build a hotel for the World's Fair. I'm going to add a third floor onto the building, and we're going to use it as World's Fair Flats. The World's Fair is opening in 6 months. We've got to be ready to make money. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to invest $3,000. You know, $3,000 in 1892 money. This was not junk change. But he borrowed $3,000 from Dr. Maurice Lawrence. Then got a whole bunch of furniture on credit from the Toby Furniture Company. He got a crockery from French and Potter's Crockery, doors from the Chicago Sash and Screen Door Company, fireplaces from the Dawson Brothers, and most of these things he just kind of hid away in hallways. He never actually really used any of them, and certainly never paid for them. In fact, in 1893, just shortly before the World's Fair opened, the Toby Furniture Company came to repossess everything. And Holmes said, "Furniture? I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have any furniture here. That must have been some other guy." And they would get a search warrant and look around, but not be able to find anything. Finally, a guy who worked in the building came up to the Toby Furniture Company and said, "Hey, I know where your furniture is, and for $50, I'll show it to you." So they gave this guy the $50, and he showed them a hidden room in between the first and second floor where a lot of furniture was being hidden. Then he showed another room on the second floor where the door had been wallpapered over so it looked like there wasn't a room there. There was more furniture in that. And it turned out this place was riddled with hidden rooms and secret passages, most of which at the time were just being used to hide stolen furniture. Then on the third floor, what he was supposed to be using as a hotel was practically a papier-mâché facade. It was really just something he could use to defraud the investors. He never paid Dr. Lawrence back his $3,000. Dr. Lawrence eventually sued him. That lawsuit is still on file, with all of the promissory notes still in Holmes's handwriting, which is kind of cool to hold in your own hands now. But the third floor, while the furniture company was poking around the third floor, one guy went up to the roof thinking, well, maybe he put the rest of the furniture on the roof, and while he was walking around, his foot went right through the ceiling. It was that cheaply built. So I'm not really sure of the extent to which it really functioned as a hotel. Frankly, I think a lot of the hotels that we built around the neighborhood for the World's Fair in 1893 were probably not a whole lot better than that. In fact, the World's Fair buildings themselves were just made out of temporary material. They weren't really built to last. But the New York World eventually published this diagram of it. It was based on a couple of different diagrams that had been in Chicago papers already, and it gave it all of these lurid names, like this was the Room of the Three Corpses, the Mysterious Closed Room, the Blind Room, the Dark Room, the Death Shaft, the Death Tunnel, the Black Closet, the Maze. All of these lurid names, most of which at least came from some kind of a kernel of truth. Like the Room of the Three Corpses is one where a guy named Myron G. Chappell showed up at the castle while the police were investigating it and said, "You know what? I used to buy dead bodies from this guy. I used to turn them into skeletons for him." Books always call him Charles Chappell. Charles Chappell was his son. His name was Myron G. Chappell. And he took them up and said, "Here, I bought 3 dead bodies right out of this room." He had them all just sitting there all piled up. And I carted them away, and I've still got one of the skeletons, in fact. He still had one of the skeletons of a body that he claimed to have bought from H.H. Holmes. Most of it he was keeping in his attic, except for the skull, which he was dangling from a branch outside of a tree in his house. His neighbors must have just loved this guy. His story didn't really hold up that well. The names and dates that he had were all hopelessly confused. The medical schools that he said that he sold skeletons to, we've had all kinds of records saying, no, we definitely never bought a skeleton off of this guy. So he might have bought 1 or 2 bodies off of Holmes anyway. The amount that people say that he did is probably a little bit inflated, but that was the room that they just kind of picked that out. Maybe it was that room that was the Room of the Three Corpses. Elsewhere in the article, over in the text of it, it mentions that there's a little line that I think is quoted verbatim in Devil in the White City, that an awful lot of people who came to Chicago for the World's Fair never came home again, and in a greater number of those foul play was suspected. How many of these people might have checked into Holmes's hotel? That one little paragraph really forms the basis of everything we think about H.H. Holmes. Every single legend about him since then has grown out of that. Another good example, though, also is the famous line, "I was born with the devil in me. The evil one was sitting by my bedside as my sponsor when I was born." That's I think that's where the title comes from in Devil in the White City, and I don't think Holmes actually said that. That was published in excerpts of his confession that came out in 1896. Right before he was hanged, he published a really large confession. This confession, he said that he had killed 27 people over the course of his career, which is about 15 more than the police really suspected him of at the time. But the problem is 3 of the people he confessed to killing were actually still alive at the time. One of them was a woman named Kate Durkee, and she was somebody I got really into researching a few months ago. I found in one of the lawsuits had a huge cross-examination with her where she comes off as really kind of a badass. She was one of Holmes's insurance dupes. She was a friend of one of his wives. Now and then when she was visiting, he would say, "Hey, I have a business proposition for you. I can get you a couple $1,000, and all you have to do is sign your name right here." And, he would put his name all over his various business dealings. And when the newspapers found her eventually, he said, oh, well, I have no head for business, so I just did what he said. And the cross-examination, they had gone clear out to Omaha where she'd lived. One of the insurance companies didn't believe she was a real person, so they went out to interview her. And the lawyer was asking questions like, so, did H.H. Holmes give you the money for that building? And she said, I got my money. And he said, but did H.H. Holmes give you the money? And she said, I decline to answer that. And he says, why do you decline to answer that? And she says, because I do. It's really pretty tough for a cross-examination. And then, Holmes apparently was unable to swindle her. And this is kind of a clue as to how his mind worked. Is with her and a couple other people, he couldn't swindle them, so he confessed to having murdered them, even though they were still up and walking around. Kate Durkee herself was awfully mad about this. She walked into her local post office, banged her fist on the desk, and said, I wish to make a statement. I have never been murdered. Not by H.H. Holmes, not by anybody else. But that was how he had been operating all the way through his time in Chicago. He came about 1886, and over the next several years, I can trace him to about 100 different buildings around the city, most of which were just buildings that he swindled over time. Every time I find the new lawsuit, we find more of that. Finally, after the World's Fair ended, he had probably collected quite a bit. He sold a lot of the furniture that he got from the furniture companies and just, never paid them for it, so he just pocketed all the profit. Never paid Dr. Merle's Lawrence back his $3,000. And then according to one of those lawsuits, in August of 1893, right in the middle of the World's Fair, he torched the third floor. The third floor was absolutely wrecked, entirely for the insurance money. And the lawsuit lists all of the different insurance companies that he had policies with. It was a lot of them. There was a Canadian insurance company that he'd bought a policy from. It's something that's gone into history is that Holmes was really into dealing with insurance companies. Something that we hear about him a lot is that he used to buy people insurance policies, make himself the beneficiary, and then kill them. One thing we can see from the records is that he certainly tried to do this a lot. I think only one guy was ever actually dumb enough to fall for it. But we do know there was one guy in particular, Ned Connor, whose wife is one of his victims, told the newspapers a story a couple of years later saying, he was always bothering me to buy life insurance. He had an agent that would always pester me about it, and I kept telling him, no, I don't want a policy. And one day he even came and said, listen, I can get you a policy on your life for as little as $1. And Ned told him, I will give you $1 if you want $1 that badly, but I don't want a life insurance policy. But finally, after the World's Fair, after the fire at the castle, Holmes went up to one of his partners, Benjamin Pitezel, who'd been working with him on swindle after swindle for quite a long time, and said, Ben, here's what we're going to do now. We are going to fake your death. We're going to find a dead body who looks like you. I went to medical school. I know where to get dead bodies. It's all we did in medical school was dig up dead bodies. So we'll find a dead body who looks like you. Nobody knows you in Philadelphia. So we'll take the dead body. We'll say that it's you. And we've got your life insured with Fidelity Mutual for $10,000. We'll take the money, split it, move to South America, live like kings. Having been working with H.H. Holmes for many years at this point, you really think that Ben Pitezel would have known better. But he didn't. He went to Philadelphia with Holmes, lived there for a couple of months, appears to have done very little besides sit around drinking, and then was eventually found dead in his house in what looked like an explosion. Holmes had rigged it up. He had killed him with chloroform poisoning and rigged it up so it looked like he had been doing some sort of science experiment and then lit a pipe and there was a big explosion. He was living there under the name B.F. Perry. He was buried in a pauper's grave, a shallow grave in the Potter's Field under the name B.F. Perry. A couple of weeks later, Fidelity Mutual got a letter saying that man from H.H. Holmes, saying that man that you buried under the name B.F. Perry in Philadelphia was actually Benjamin Pitezel. You owe his widow $10,000. I'll be coming out there to identify the body, so will one of his daughters. So Holmes went out to Philadelphia along with a lawyer named Jephthah Howe, who seems to have been in on the deal. He eventually got off the hook. I have no idea how the hell he got off of the hook, but he seems to have been somehow in on the deal. Jephthah Howe came along with Alice Pitezel, Benjamin's 14-year-old daughter. They went out to the Potter's Field and dug the body up. Holmes immediately said, "You see, I can identify him based on that wart on the back of his neck. That was definitely Benjamin Pitezel." He pulled a pocket knife from his pocket, cut off the wart, and put it in his pocket. For reasons entirely unclear. The guy had been to medical school. And we do happen to know, in fact, that one of his colleagues from medical school said that he seemed to take uncanny delight in the weird things of the dissecting room. This was kind of a scandal among people in those days. The 1880s was still right in the height of the era when everybody kind of looked askew at medical school students because they knew about all the grave robbing that was going on. Nobody donated their body to science, and you cannot train a new doctor without giving them dead bodies to practice on. So the schools just had like an open door policy. If he showed up with a fresh corpse, you could trade it in for cash or prizes. In fact, they were paying as much as you'd make in a month in the coal mines for one body, and a good grave robber could get 5 or 6 of them in one night. It was sort of a rite of passage for medical school students to dig up their own bodies. Holmes actually lived with several other medical school students in a house on Cemetery Street in Ann Arbor when he was in medical school. I haven't figured out if that house is still standing yet. I really hope that it is. Minor interruption. But he would have been fairly used to carving up dead bodies and cutting off warts and things. In fact, there was one particularly good anecdote. One of the medical school colleagues later remembered that one time he was really excited. Holmes was that he was going home on the holidays, and the professor had given him the body of a dead baby to take home and dissect at home. Just imagine this: the guy's riding along on the train, he's got a dead baby up on the overhead luggage, thinking, "Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy." Which for a medical school student wouldn't have been that uncommon. They got very jaded to this kind of thing. So he identified the body of Benjamin Pitezel. They covered up everything but the teeth and let Alice at least identify the body just on the teeth. They were at least as humane as that. Holmes then collected all of the money from Fidelity Mutual and promptly swindled the widow out of all but about 300 of it. And then started traveling around with 3 different, what they called compartments or attachments. Imagine that they were traveling around. On one train car, he would have Alice Pitezel along with her brother Howard and her sister Nellie. In another car, he had Mrs. Pitezel and a couple of their other children, Desi and the one I don't know what the baby's name was offhand. I've looked it up before, but they always just called it Baby. And then in the third car, he had his latest wife, Georgiana Yoke. He was married at this point to 3 or 4 different people. It's difficult to tell exactly, partly because some of them were not probably legal weddings. He probably just hired somebody to say, "Hey, put on a collar and come pretend you're marrying us tomorrow. Here's $20. He had been married initially when he was about 17 to a woman named Clara Lovering in New Hampshire. He had a son with her, a son named Robert, then disappeared, went off to medical school. Shortly after that, he took up with Myrta Zutik Belknap in Minneapolis. They moved to Chicago along with her entire family, and she lived with him for years. I don't think Myrta ever really decided for sure that she believed Holmes was guilty. She kept the name Holmes for the rest of her life, even after she found out that wasn't his real name. Their daughter, Lucy, kept that name up until the time she got married herself. While he was in Chicago, he also took up with a woman named Minnie Williams. She was the one who disappeared. We're not really sure if he was married to Minnie. He refers to her as a wife a couple of times, but there's certainly no marriage record on file. Shortly after Minnie disappeared, he took up with Georgiana Yoke, who worked at a Chicago department store, married her in Denver, and was traveling around with her at the time. I'm not sure Georgiana really knew what they were doing traveling around like this. She thought there was some sort of business dealings, but she wasn't sure what. The Pitezels in both of the compartments, both of the attachments, thought that they were going to find Benjamin. At least that's what Holmes told them anyway. He kept telling them, no, he's still alive. He's just in hiding. Next city we get to, he's going to be there waiting for us. And then you get there and, we just missed him. And then the next city, we just missed him. But the problem was Alice had identified the body. Alice would have known that her father was dead, and she probably would have told her siblings that as well. So her first order of business for Holmes was getting rid of them. Eventually, he got down to two attachments. There's a letter from Alice that she wrote and sent, but Holmes never actually sent on. They eventually confiscated it from him, and she just casually says, "Howard is not with us anymore." And then Alice and Nellie disappear after Toronto. Holmes was in the process of getting rid of Mrs. Pitezel as well. He tried to trick her into taking a whole bunch of explosives down into a basement where it would have exploded, but never quite worked out. Eventually, he got word that the authorities were looking for him. The insurance company had gotten wise. They had put 2 and 2 together. They had a hot tip from a train robber that Holmes had shared a cell with in Chicago for a while. And they decided, you know what, maybe this was all a swindle. This guy's a known swindler. There was this whole article in the Chicago Tribune about this weird building he had on 63rd Street full of secret passages and hidden rooms for swindling furniture companies. Why don't we figure out why don't we have him arrested and see if that was really Benjamin Pitezel in that grave or what? They traced him to Boston. He'd been traveling around. He was having all of his mail sent to a place in Chicago right where the Block 37 shopping center is now. So right where the Disney store is now, Holmes was having all of his mail sent. And that guy knew where to forward. The guy who was in that office knew where to forward things. So they traced him to Boston. They got a coroner's warrant, but the Boston police didn't want to act on a coroner's warrant. But then they found out that Holmes was also wanted in Texas. He had gone down to Texas and gotten involved in a horse swindle. So he was also wanted as a horse thief. So they arrested him actually as a horse thief in Boston, and Holmes said, listen, there is no way I am going to Texas to stand trial as a horse thief. I'm probably also wanted for insurance fraud in Philadelphia. Why don't you send me there instead? And for about a week, Holmes was the most famous man in the world, just as a swindler. This guy had pulled off a $10,000 trick on the insurance company, and that just fascinated people. Newspapers were giving him entire couple-page spreads, talking about all the swindles he had done in Chicago. But then a couple people also noticed, hey, there were some people who lived and worked in that castle building that I haven't seen around in a while. And what happened to those children he was traveling around with? And Holmes had explanations for everything. He said, I gave the children to a woman named Minnie Williams. She took them over to England. I'm sure they're all just fine. Also, it came out that there had been a woman in the castle the year before named Emmeline Segran, or a couple of years before. She had been living and working in the building, then suddenly disappeared. 1891, there had been a woman named Julia Connor who left her husband to be with H.H. Holmes, never actually married him, just kept living and working for him in the castle until she and her daughter both mysteriously disappeared. And some people started to wonder, maybe that really was Benjamin Pitezel in the grave, but maybe it wasn't an accidental death like it looked like. So some people started talking about, hey, didn't this guy also have a building on 63rd Street that was full of hidden rooms and secret passages? But at the time, nothing really came of it. They hadn't found any bodies at that point. The building was just kind of sitting more or less deserted. I think Patrick Quinlan, the janitor, was still living on the second floor. The drugstore and the restaurant and the candy store on the first floor were still in operation. But for the most part, it was just kind of sitting there empty. That wasn't too unusual. There were a lot of buildings after the fair that were just sitting there empty. So for about 6 months, nothing happened. Holmes sat in prison awaiting trial for insurance fraud. Newspapers kind of forgot about him. Then in July, Alice and Nellie's bodies were found buried in a trunk underneath a cellar in Toronto at a house that Holmes had rented. Soon as those bodies were found, everybody knew that there was murder in this case. It wasn't just a simple swindling case. That was when every newspaper reporter and every single police officer they could spare swarmed on the old building that they now started calling the castle. That was when all of these newspaper items and the maps and things started being published. There was even a book written about it very early on, while Holmes was still alive. There was this guy, The Holmes Castle by Robert L. Corbett, who was a wannabe playwright and amateur detective, who somehow managed to weasel his way into the investigation. He was in there with the cops digging through a lot of stuff. He came into possession of several of Holmes's papers, his account book, several of his letters, a pistol that Holmes had owned. How he managed to weasel his way into it like this, I don't really know. From what we can tell about the guy, he seems to have spent most of the time sitting on his butt and occasionally getting up to beat his wife. We know this because his divorce records are still on file. He seems to have been a real no account. His attempts to be a playwright came to nothing. A couple of times he went on trial for his sanity in the 1920s. Occasionally shows up in the news when he's decided he's going to be a detective now. But he somehow did manage to weasel his way into the Holmes Castle investigation. He actually believed that Holmes was innocent. Or at least he said he did. You notice there's this interesting pattern with him, where whenever Corbett shows up in the newspaper, one day he'll be saying, I found the answer, I found the solution, I know exactly what's going to happen with H.H. Holmes now. Then the next day he's in the newspaper because his wife has disappeared. Or the next day, and then he'll be back in the news saying, nope, I figured it all out, Holmes was innocent the whole time. Then he'll come up with, I found new evidence against H.H. Holmes. Then Robert Corbett disappeared. Then he'd come back and say, no, he was innocent the whole time. I have no idea what was going on with the guy, really. It certainly seems like he was up to something. Holmes had a number of different confederates around the city, most notable of which was a guy named Patrick Quinlan. He was like the Igor of the murder castle. He worked for Holmes, but as near as I can tell, his whole job was just to lurk around acting all spooky. And the police were horribly suspicious of him. The guy owned a farm in Michigan and was making all kinds of money with that. But rather than working on the farm, he was here in Chicago working for like $3 a week from a guy who didn't even pay him half the time. Holmes at least had to have some kind of dirt on the guy. They kept the guy in the sweat box, kept questioning him for days and days and days and never really got anything out of him. But for about 3 weeks, the investigators went all the way through the castle. For a couple of weeks, there's a thing you notice in the newspapers where they say, we found a rope. He must have been hanging people. Or, we found a bench. I'll bet it was a dissection table. There were ashes in the wood-burning stove. I bet he cremated the Minnie Williams and her sister. And some of this stuff really does get folded into the story over time. Like a lot of the books still say that he was cremating bodies in the wood-burning stove in the castle. Now, ask any mortician if you could cremate a body in a wood-burning stove. You could scorch them pretty good, but you really just can't cremate somebody in a wood-burning stove. There weren't that many mechanisms for getting rid of a dead body in the castle itself. It's very difficult to get rid of a dead body without everybody noticing the smell. Very difficult. And it was a fairly crowded building at the time, too. A lot of people lived on the second floor. People were always in and out of working on the first floor. But for about a week, they were everything they could possibly find. They were saying this must be how he did it. And the best one that they did find was the third floor of the castle had a soundproof vault on it. Holmes was fond of showing off that this was soundproof. A lot of people remember that whenever he would have the gentleman from the neighborhood around for brandy and cigars, he would say to one of them, hey, why don't you get into my vault and scream as loud as you can so everybody can see that it's soundproof? And people would go in and scream, and then they would come out and say, nope, nobody heard a thing. Now, can you think of one practical reason you would need your walk-in vault to be soundproof? Can anybody think of one practical reason? They did find there was a footprint embedded into the door. It's an interesting thing, trying to read into the footprint. I was really hoping I could find a photograph of it or something, but it would have been the thing that would be very hard to photograph with a 19th century camera, particularly just based on the fact that it was indoors. But the Tribune at least talked about it. It was quite a ways into the investigation. They'd found the vault days before when somebody realized, hey, there's a footprint on this door. And for some reason, the Tribune was the only paper that talked about it. None of the others that were really investigating in depth really mentioned the footprint too much. But it was there, and it did get folded into the story eventually. My favorite thing about the investigation is while they were digging up the basement, they found some mysterious gas tank. It had some kind of weird liquid emitting a noxious odor coming out of it. And this just shows you the caliber of guys they had doing the investigation. One guy said, mysterious gas tank emitting a noxious odor. I'd better light a match to get a better look at that. So the big dummy lit a match, big explosion. Several people were injured. Miraculously, nobody is killed. Several people were injured. And thereafter, the next line in the newspaper article about it tells about the chief investigator decided, okay, I've got to figure out what that stuff in the tank is. I'll taste some of it. So the genius himself dips his finger into the gas tank, has a good lick. Next line in the paper is that he had to be locked in an upstairs room for the next 2 hours while he acted as though he were one demented. And exactly what was in that tank, I'm still not really sure, because it was one of those things where for every expert, there was an equal but opposite expert. One newspaper would publish a chemical analysis of it saying that it was just harmless heating gas. The next one would say, oh, no, that's not harmless at all. If you were to mix that with a couple of drops of a common household chemical, it would emit a noxious odor that would kill a person in seconds. That could be like bleach and ammonia, though. You could say that about pretty much any kind of gas. So it's difficult to tell exactly what was going on in the basement, how much of the stuff he had really planned to kill people, how much of it was really just what you would have in a building normally, and how much of it was really just one big insurance fraud on his case. But the fact remains several people did disappear out of the building. There's only really a photograph of one of them. Let's see. Yeah, the only one who I think there is actually a photograph of out of his victims, well, two of them. There's Minnie Williams and her sister Anna. This was Minnie, the one who was apparently his wife. She seems to have thought he was his wife. Holmes later said that she was the one who killed her sister when she disappeared. Now, she does seem to have had a better idea of what was going on than some of the other people did. She knew Holmes under the name of Harry Gordon. But she knew that wasn't his real name. I know that for a fact because her signature is all over H.H. Holmes' paperwork. All over the property records, and we've got what her forged signature looks like, and we've got what her real signature looked like. She signed several court summons for H.H. Holmes, so she seems to have had somewhat of a better idea of what was going on. She came to Chicago in early 1893. Holmes had apparently met her in Denver a while before, found out she had a whole bunch of property down in Texas that he would like to get his hands on. Mostly lived around the north side. She wasn't really in the castle too often, but she was apparently at least engaged to Holmes. They ended up getting an apartment together, which makes me think that she at least thought that she was married to him. Shortly thereafter, her sister Anna joined her in Chicago. They were both last seen around the 4th of July of 1893. Right in the middle of the fair. Holmes, the last anybody heard of him was a couple of the neighbors remember that he had gone to that Anna had gone to the fair with H.H. Holmes. They were sitting on the porch talking about how much fun the Ferris wheel was. But then she was never seen again. The next day, several of Holmes's real estate holdings were transferred to Minnie Williams, who had also disappeared. I'm still trying to figure out what he was up to there. There's a lot of property records, but they're basically illegible. It's a problem we have in the legal archives sometimes, is a lot of this stuff is handwritten and some of it is absolutely illegible. Holmes had 3 different lawyers. One of them was a guy named Edward Maher, who has, I love it when an Edward Maher case comes up because he had the best handwriting. Then there was a guy named Wharton Plummer who had fairly bad handwriting and seems to have had an IQ of about 1. When the papers were really going through the H.H. Holmes thing, they found out all this stuff about H.S. Campbell, one of Holmes's aliases, and Wharton Plummer was all over saying, no, I'm sure there was a real person named H.S. Campbell. It wasn't just Holmes. I never met him, but Holmes always talked about him like he was a whole different person. Meanwhile, there's several lawsuits with Wharton Plummer's signature where the top it says H.H. Holmes alias H.S. Campbell. So, I don't know what Holmes was telling him, but the guy doesn't seem to have been too private. The other guy, D.T. Duncombe. D.T. Gumcombe was the other lawyer. His handwriting was like chicken scratches. And now and then I would find to type one. The guy seems to have been the sleaziest lawyer in town. Perfect match for H.H. Holmes, really. And when the police were investigating everything, after Holmes had been convicted and everything, and there was nothing left to lose, Duncombe started saying, oh, yes, I knew he had killed a couple of those people. He told me all about them. And also, would you give me $10 for a photograph of Minnie Williams? I've got a photograph of Minnie Williams. I'll sell it to you for $10. There were actually a bunch of people going around saying that they had photographs for her to sell. Another victim the year before had been a woman named Emmeline Segrand. There's not a known photograph of her, but there used to be. A lot of the newspapers make references to photographs, especially one where she's looking over her shoulder. So it was probably this is probably a drawing based on a photograph that was extant at one point or another. It might still be out there someplace. You never know what we're going to find. She had come to Chicago about 1892. My favorite story about her is when she first moved into the neighborhood, she went up to a landlord and said, I'm looking for a room. And he said, I like seeing a young woman making her own way in the world. The normal rent is $1.50 a week. I'll let you have it for $1 a week. And she said, oh, you don't have to do that. I will pay my share. I will pay the full amount. End of the week, she showed up with exactly $1. And she worked for Holmes in the castle. She worked as his typewriter, his stenographer, and had an affair with somebody. Quite likely H.H. Holmes, but there's so many conflicting accounts as to who it was that she was seeing, who she was having an affair with, that I really have no idea who it was. It might have been Holmes, it might have been one of his confidants, but then all of a sudden in 1892, she just disappeared. Some of the neighbors, the Lawrences, who were loaning Holmes the money to build the third floor, had gotten to be really good friends with Emmeline, and they said, hey, where did she go? And he said, oh, she got married and went off to England. Do you believe it? And the next day, he showed up with a hastily printed wedding invitation that just said, Robert Phelps and Emmeline Segrand, wedded this day. As far as the police ever figured out, there was no actual Robert Phelps. She was, I don't know exactly what it was Holmes had against her, what she had found out about him that made him want to get rid of her. It's possible that she got pregnant and he performed an abortion on her and killed her while he was at it. That's quite likely also what happened to the previous one, Julia Connor. It's not a photograph of Julia Connor. I don't know if that one's based on a photograph or not. But she and her husband, Ned, the insurance policy guy, had moved into the castle about 1891. He was working in the jewelry department. But she kind of started openly seeing H.H. Holmes on the side, and finally they decided they were going to have an amicable separation. Ned went off and worked someplace else. Julia stayed at the castle until about Christmas of 1891, when both she and her daughter, Pearl, disappeared off of the face of the earth. Throughout 1892, Holmes wrote letters to her relatives asking if they had seen her because she owed him money. Over and over he went with this. They eventually found some bones in the basement that were probably Pearl Connor's bones. Another thing is, sometime after that, after they had disappeared, Ned had to go back to the castle to talk about Holmes about something to do with the jewelry business. And they had just a friendly chat. But somewhere in the middle of that friendly chat, Holmes, we don't know exactly what he said, but Ned told reporters that Holmes said something about Julia that he could not have known about her unless he had been with her intimately. This is the kind of guy Holmes was. He would, have a friendly chat, and by the way, just mention in a little hint, by the way, hint, hint, I am sleeping with your ex-wife. Getting kind of close to questions, that kind of brings me to the main thing that I really like to point out from people. It is difficult, but kind of tying into Holmes's various affairs. We'll get back to it in 1 second. One other thing to figure out is Holmes did go on trial just for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel in 1895 in Philadelphia. The first day he fired his attorneys. And we've all probably heard the old quote, "A man who represents himself as a fool for a client." But by all accounts, Holmes did a pretty good job for the day or so that he represented himself. He was put on trial just for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. They tried to introduce things about the Pitezel children as well, but the judge ruled that's neither here nor there. We're just here to talk about the one that happened here in the Commonwealth. After the prosecution made their case, the defense decided not to enter one at all. They decided that they had done such a bad job proving that H.H. Holmes had murdered Benjamin Pitezel that they just wouldn't enter a case at all. They were going to quit while they were ahead. A lot of legal watchers thought that they were doing the right thing, too, because they had established that Pitezel had been murdered, but all they could really get to connect Holmes with him was they did say that they found one witness who had seen Holmes around the building in Philadelphia. That was it. But the jury convicted him in about an hour. And one of them even told reporters, even if they hadn't made the case here, we'd all heard all the other stories about this guy. Which, as a juror, you're not really supposed to do that sort of thing. But it probably just saved everybody a lot of time and hassle in the long run. They had much more solid evidence against him in Toronto, plenty against him in Irvington. Chicago would have been maybe third or fourth on the list. But he was sentenced to hang for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. A few months later, he stopped trying to appeal and wrote his confession, the one in which he confessed to killing 27 people, a few of whom were still alive, and a few of whom don't really seem to have existed in the first place. And a few others he didn't really give enough details that we can check one way or the other. So he was hanged at Moyamensing Prison in May of 1896. The weirdest part about this is he was buried in a double deep grave covered in cement. This was starting to be a fad at the time. There was a merchant in New York named A.T. Stewart. He had been buried in New York, and then his bones were stolen and held for ransom. So a lot of notable people, starting around 1896, guys like George Pullman, started having their bodies buried under cement and railroad ties just so that their families couldn't be harassed to pay the ransom on their bones later on. That's probably what Holmes was thinking of at the time. A few years later, that's what they did with Abraham Lincoln, too. They'd moved his body several times, and finally in 1901, after this fad came up, they put him under 10 feet of cement down in Springfield, which is still where he is to this day. But that was the end of Holmes' career, other than stories of the Holmes curse. And it is a thing that an awful lot of people who were involved in the prosecution eventually came to no good end. A few months after the execution, Robert Motherwell, the main jailer, walked into his office looking upset, and everybody said, "Robert, did you sleep okay?" And he said, "No, I did not sleep okay." Then he walked into his inner office and shot himself. About 10 years later, Patrick Quinlan, the janitor at the castle, wrote a note saying, "I could not sleep," and killed himself with strychnine. The jury foreman, a guy named Linford Biles, just before the execution, in fact, was electrocuted on top of his house. One of the other jurors walked up to somebody's door one day, knocked on the door, then the person opened the door, he shot himself in the head. Kate Durkee died a few years later of causes I haven't found out about yet. The newspapers eventually identified about 24 different people that they talked about as victims of the Holmes curse over the course of about 30 years after this. When I started looking that up, I really thought that was just going to be something that a pulp writer made up in the 30s or 40s. But that really was a thing. It actually happened. There were 4 or 5 people connected to the case who died before Holmes was even executed. But the last thing I like to leave people with before I go for questions is maybe my favorite piece of data about H.H. Holmes of them all. As I mentioned, it's very difficult to get really accurate data about this guy, but one of the more reliable things we have is a report on his physique that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. While he was in prison, a doctor came to examine him. And he spent most of the time looking at the bumps and ridges on his skull. This was still an era when they thought they could tell a lot about you by the shape of your skull. And Holmes had a particular dent on there that there were a lot of different weird explanations for. In fact, while he was on the run, he actually showed back up in New Hampshire, where his old family was. And he said, "Hey, everybody, I'm back. See, I've got this dent on my head. This will explain everything. See, here's why I haven't been around a while. One time, I was out walking around by the railroads and a brick fell on my head, and I got amnesia. And I just remembered who I am now, and that's why I've been gone all of this time." And the family seems to have gone along with it for the couple of days or so that he was still there. But so most of the time the doctor was talking about the bumps and ridges on his skull, but in the middle of all of the talks of the bumps and ridges, there is this one particular line: "Sexual organs unusually small." So, one last piece of the puzzle there. And I can't top that, so this is usually the point of the presentation where I go to questions. And even if it's something totally off the wall, believe me, I get weirder things in my email box than anything you guys could think of. Especially since the Lincoln book came out. Go for it. Yes, his real name was Herman Webster Mudgett. Yeah. Yeah, that would be Jeff Mudgett right there. I've worked with Jeff a number of times. He's a nice guy. He kind of likes to sensationalize the story. When he goes on, he'll say Holmes killed thousands of people. And he has a theory that Holmes was actually Jack the Ripper, too. And I've got enough paperwork putting Holmes in Chicago in the fall of 1888 that I'm pretty sure he wasn't Jack the Ripper. But here's the thing. There's always something about these pieces of paperwork that have a little bit of reason to doubt. Like, he registered to vote in Chicago in October of 1888, but it's a clerk's handwriting. There was a big lawsuit going on that he was involved in, but it could be just that his lawyer was entering his appearance. It's never actually in his handwriting. It's almost like he's teasing me from across the centuries. I just can't quite find the smoking gun on that. But stabbing random prostitutes was not really Holmes's style. The people that we know of that he killed were people that he knew very well, and usually with chloroform poisoning. In fact, there's even a thing when they were doing the big investigation of the castle, they talked to Inspector Fitzpatrick, the chief investigator, and they said, hey, there was that brutal murder up in Wilmette just around the block from his house. Do you think that was him? And the guy laughed and said, no, Holmes was a scientific killer. You might just as well try to connect him to the Jack the Ripper horrors in London as connect him to that. And of course, having no idea that eventually people would be doing exactly that. The story just grows and grows and grows. In the 1930s, they started saying that that Holmes's estimated victims was in the hundreds. Around Halloween, now it goes up to the thousands. Okay. There was a large furnace, but they weren't really sure what he was doing with it. There was a large furnace, and there was also, they would talk about the wood-burning stove being a crematorium. We do know also, though, that he started up several glass-bending businesses. He never actually had any idea how to bend glass, but that gave him an excuse not only to defraud investors up for a new business, but also to build very large furnaces. He tried to build one that was in the basement of the castle, but it didn't work too well. There was another about a block away, then another one, a really big one, up on Damon Elston and Fullerton. And when they were first investigating the castle, but they couldn't find Patrick Quinlan, they thought Quinlan must be dead off in a ditch someplace himself. But it turned out that Quinlan had been up in the north side, emptying cartload after cartload of garbage out of this glass-bending factory. And by the cops found it, all that was left in it was some of Holmes's paperwork, some ashes that they couldn't quite trace. And forensics were not quite there yet. They couldn't tell if they were human ashes or what. And also the wreck of a 150-foot-long furnace. Now, the reasons that a multi-murderer would want a 150-foot-long furnace is a pretty short list. So I'm not sure that he had a crematory that was active in the basement, but I'm sure he probably tried to get one. Anything else? Sure. On H.H. Holmes, about 8 or 9 years now, I'd say. And this is, thousands and thousands of articles, stuff in the microfilm room, stuff in the legal archives, stuff in the property records. You never know when we're going to find something new. But I hope to have a book about him eventually. When we get a release date for the movie, then we'll probably know the release date for the book. But, sure. Yeah, I do about 200 ghost tours a year in Chicago. I'm sorry? Yeah, I got some cards up here. Just come see me afterwards. Yeah. If you go to mysteriouschicago.com, that'll link you to all my various tours. I've got one that I'm really excited about in a couple of weeks. I'm going to do a grave robbing tour in Lincoln Park. Lincoln Park was the old city cemetery. They had a major problem with grave robbing. I'm not only going to tell the stories, I'm also going to teach you the tricks of the trade. So you can launch your career as a 19th century grave robber the Adam way. Sure. Not that I know of. But they haven't contacted me yet, if you got a phone number for them. I think so, yeah. They just recently announced that Scorsese and DiCaprio are officially doing the movie. And that makes me feel a lot better, because, when I picture the movie, I think we're going to get this big long shot of Daniel Burnham chasing Holmes down the midway and, climbing up the Ferris wheel. And I don't expect the movie to be accurate by any means, but, Scorsese and DiCaprio, they don't make no junk. Scorsese had a particularly good line when Gangs in New York came out. He said, no, this isn't a documentary, it's an opera. Like, okay, that I can get behind that. And Larson, too, is very upfront in Devil in the White City about which parts. If you read his endnotes, he's very upfront about which parts he's just making up. But nobody reads the endnotes. So, sure. For this individual, really, it's because I'll be straight up with you. The reason I started researching him was because one of the companies I was working with wanted me to start doing Devil in the White City tours. So I read the book, and then I decided, I'll pop into the library and see if they've got anything else in the microfilm room, and then you fall down the rabbit hole. There is just so much about this guy that was published in the 1890s that hasn't really been re-examined yet. And something I'm continually amazed when I find things in the microfilm rooms or even in like online genealogy sites that archive newspapers, all the stuff that hasn't come up before. I mean, I found like firsthand accounts of Abraham Lincoln attending seances in the White House that had never been examined before, had never been written about before. I thought everything to do with Lincoln especially was long since covered by now. But there's still stuff buried in these reels that have just been totally forgotten and totally slipped through the cracks. Anything else? Again, guys, even if it's totally off the wall, you should see what I get since that Lincoln book came out. I've been getting a lot of emails from a rapper who says that he's the reincarnation of Lincoln and Moses and several other people too, I believe. But pretty good rapper, though. All right, well, thank you guys very much for coming out. I think they still have some books left back there. And thanks to the Kankakee Library for having me.